who is digging today into a lot of paperwork, a lot of files, the personnel files of Greg McMichael, because he was a public employee, a police officer, part of law enforcement down there in Glynn County.
Thousands of pages, Vinny, lots and lots and lots of pages. And I think it's critical to go through the pages. Not tonight. We actually synthesized, lucky. But I think what's critical is that if we're going to look at the behavior of someone who's charged with murder, aggravated murder and assault, you need to know what the last 30 years of policing were like. And it's a complicated mix, as was expected. When we went through the hundreds of pages, specifically about his personnel file, we did find a lot of criticism. Much of it was sort of kind of nicky-nacky, like you're stretched too thin, you're letting some balls drop, things are falling through the cracks, and there's a lot of disorganization and you need to prioritize. Now, none of that is sort of violent, and it doesn't have outside offenses. It doesn't have the public coming in and complaining about him, not that we have found yet, that's for sure. And what was so fascinating, Vinny, was that I thought it would be really important to talk to someone who oversees law enforcement in general on a macular level, like a national level, to ask if that's unusual. I mean, 30 years, you should probably have hundreds of pages of personnel files if you've been policing for over 30 years. So I asked Cedric Alexander. He's someone I've grown very familiar with over the years of covering crime and justice. He's the past president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers, but he's also the former public safety director for DeKalb County, Georgia. And I asked him to sort of weigh in on that, those nicky-nacky things about being, disorganized, et cetera, all throughout the file. And here's what he said.
This is an agency that appears to have had a history of problems. And for me, as someone who has chiefed two major police departments in this country, and one of them being DeKalb County right there in Georgia, I am perplexed by the fact that I see in what appears to me when I look at this agency across the board over time, there just appears to be some real issues around leadership and around training, because I think at some point, the state of Georgia, its assembly, its legislature is going to have to begin to take a look to really see if this department is really viable and capable of providing good public service. And I think the Albury case, and once this goes into a court hearing, into a trial, we're going to probably find out more. More is going to be revealed, but I think at some point, I would not be surprised if the state of Georgia don't take a serious look into this department to determine really whether they should keep their accreditation.
So interesting, the disorganization within this police department, Dr. Alexander looks to, a larger problem at the state level, in fact, not just this department. And there's a reason he does that, Vinny. He talks about how the body that oversees the training and the regulation of the police officer standards, it's actually called Post Police Officer Standards and Training. They're the ones who are supposed to keep track of this stuff. And when we looked through these records, Vinny, it was really hard. There were dates missing, and there was a lot of stuff that was very hard to track. It wasn't super duper clear, so to speak.
Yeah, that organization Post, I know from living down here in Georgia that anytime there's a police shooting or a case involving police, that's the first thing they want to look at is the Post file and the records there. And I know Cedric Alexander was talking about that and talking about perhaps the way they're overseeing these officers is a little bit sloppy. Let's take a listen.
Poor record keeping. Poor record keeping. You should have clear documentation of the training that each one of your officers go through, from the time that they leave that academy to the time that they do post-training beyond their academy time. There should be accurate, concise, succinct, and clearly stated entries as to what has been completed, what has not been completed, and what needs to be completed within some stated period of time. That is responsible leadership from a training department, but it also speaks to each of our responsibilities, those who are post-certified, to make sure that we stay on top of those records.
Are you saying, Cedric, this could be a Georgia problem, not just a smaller community problem?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It could be a problem within the context of that community itself, and it could be far-reaching as well.
So ultimately, Ashleigh, when you look at Greg McMichael and his training and his records, I mean, did it come up short? Were there problems?
Yes, there were some serious problems. In fact, what we discovered looking through these files was that there were big gaps of training that hadn't been done. And it's not, little itty bitty computer training. It's use of force training. It's firearms requalification training. Now, it's important to note that there's a very big gap of about 8 years, 2006, 2014, where some of this training wasn't done. And yet Greg McMichael's continued policing. That's troublesome because those training sessions were supposed to have been done. I should also say that Mr. McMichael's did have some very legitimate health issues in those years. He had 2 heart attacks. His wife went through cancer treatment. He also had a major surgery and then was also treated for depression. So those are some things that factor into, but it doesn't negate the fact that you still have to have it, right? You still have to have those very important training sessions. And Vinny, he kept on policing through those 8 years, and that didn't go over well with the people who were supposed to be keeping the record.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like, so if you have someone who's not trained, but then the people overseeing it are not making sure that it's getting done, that is so problematic because everything that you touch as an officer or as law enforcement has to be, you have to be certified, it's got to be on the up and up. Otherwise, the cases that you're prosecuting and the criminals you're going after may escape prosecution as a result.
Yeah.
There's another part of your conversation.
Powers, they took his arrest powers away for this. It wasn't small. It wasn't a slap on the wrist. They said, yikes, what are you doing? Give us your badge. Give us your gun. And then there was kind of an embarrassing note that was written by the DA saying, she actually used the words embarrassing, saying that, this is an embarrassment to not only yourself, but to me, and it's a discredit. It negatively impacts this office. So this gap in training in firearms and firearms requalification and use of force for 8 years, despite the fact that he kept on policing, ended after that 8 years with, give me your badge, give me your gun. That's not good.
So he loses his arrest powers as an officer, but then is effectuating a citizen's arrest as a citizen. And I know you spoke to Cedric Alexander about that issue. Let's take a listen.
But what's very troubling with this shooting to me is that he attempted to act as if he was a sworn police officer, and he was not. He was a civilian. There was no immediate threat, no immediate harm to anyone from what we know to date. And in addition to that, Ashleigh, here's what's even more profound, is that when they ran him down in that truck, what was their intent? Well, it was clear they were going to stop him using a force and having firearms presence and ending up killing this young man. But even today in American policing across this country, many agencies have policies now that state to police officers, when you're off duty, don't get involved in those types of situations unless it is imminent danger. Other than that, you call for backup, you keep eyes and ears on the situation until uniformed sworn officers arrive.
And that makes so much sense, Ashleigh, because if you're in a situation where you're being approached by people with guns who don't have uniforms, there's no flashing lights, how are people supposed to react to that? How are you supposed to know what their intent is? At least when officers are there, you presume their intent is to stop you, perhaps arrest you, whatever it is. But when you're off duty and no one knows who you are, It's just going to create a dangerous situation for everyone, and ultimately here for Ahmaud Arbery.
Yeah, and it is, again, nothing's simple when it comes to the law in any state, and Georgia law particularly. While Dr. Alexander says that the off-duty officers are counseled, look, unless there's imminent danger, don't go, cowboy. Don't assume you're back on the job and chasing after people with a gun. So, yes, Mr. McMichael he's now retired. He's definitely not an officer, but he's a civilian, and Georgia law does allow people to effect citizens' arrest. It's complicated. There's some definite bar you need to meet there, and that will be litigated, I'm sure, if they choose to invoke that as part of the defense. But I think there's something else here, Vinny, that's interesting. And the DA, I think, bears some responsibility here, because the DA hired Mr. McMichael as an investigator, right? And there's this 8-year lapse of training, and these sloppy, poor record keeper, falling through cracks, not prioritizing reports are through his personnel file. But the DA didn't maybe vet thoroughly and considered him a good hire. I'm not saying he's not a good hire. I'm not going to weigh in on this, because I'm sure if you looked at my 30 years of personnel file, you'd probably see that I missed a few training sessions on Microsoft Word or something. I don't know. A lot of that stuff slips. I think firearms training is important. That shouldn't slip. And I think those are the kinds of things that, obviously stood out to the point where they said, badge and gun, you've been going 8 years as a peace officer and you weren't allowed to be a peace officer. However, can I say something? You've got to be fair and balanced when you report these things. You could pick apart them any way you want to see them, right? There were several commendations in his file, several letters from people, from the public, saying that he exceeded expectations on the job. He never had a civilian complaint. I'm still looking through a lot of the file, but I've looked with the producers at Core TV who are just so eagle-eyed. We have been pretty good about, combing things. And he does have a lot of accolades, people who said he works well with others. There were some, like he plays up well on the chain, maybe not so laterally well on the chain, but generally speaking, he's a good employee. And we did see that he exceeded expectations. I think that's, you have to say that. I do think, though, that this whole record-keeping stuff that was so crappy, that dates that were missing, may impact his defense. Because when you go to defend him, you need those records to be clean, crisp, clear, and transparent. Maybe they're not so good.
Absolutely. But as you said, nothing is simple. And I think those are the most profound words tonight, especially when it comes to that case. Ashleigh, thank you so much.
Vinny, this was not simple. Lots of reading.
All right.